They call it the Killing Grounds. Not officially, of course. The maps still call it Gilgo Beach. The property listings describe it as a quiet, windswept strip of land on Long Island's South Shore. Fishermen still come here to drop crab pots. And in summer, the tourists arrive with sunblock and folding chairs. But at night, when the Atlantic wind sweeps over the dunes and the only sound is the whisper of tall grass, the beach is a different place. And if you were unlucky enough to be here during those years, you might have crossed paths with him. It was already freezing when Maureen Brainerd Barnes stepped out of the cab. The driver leaned over the passenger seat, his voice muffled by the thick scarf around his neck. "You sure this is the spot?" Maureen gave a quick nod. "Yeah, I'm sure." The wind bit at her cheeks, and she pulled her jacket tighter. Her cheap leather gloves did little to stop the cold. In the distance, she could see the rows of beach houses, some dark, others glowing with a faint yellow light. The ocean was just beyond them, invisible in the darkness, but loud enough to feel close. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. One new text message. "It's me. I'm outside." Her breath caught. Maureen glanced up and down the narrow street. No headlights, no idling cars, just the shifting shadows of swaying grass and the faint outline of the boardwalk leading toward the beach. She hesitated, then started walking. Melissa Bartholomew had done this before. She knew the drill. Meet in a public spot first, keep the phone close, trust your instincts. But this time felt different. The voice on the phone had been calm, almost too calm. "Don't worry," he'd said. "I'll take care of you. I'm a gentleman." Now, as she stood under the dim street lamp, waiting, she thought about those words. The street here felt too empty, like it was holding its breath. Then headlights. A black SUV rolled up slowly, its tires crunching against the gravel shoulder. The window slid down just enough for a voice to emerge. "Melissa?" She smiled faintly, masking the sudden knot in her stomach. "Yeah, that's me." The passenger door clicked open. Megan Waterman told herself this was just another client, just another night. She was 22, but the streets had aged her faster than the years could count. She kept her hair straightened and her smile easy. But deep down, she knew something had shifted lately. The ads weren't pulling as many calls. The regulars were disappearing. When the call came in, it was late, too late for the usual hotels. He suggested one out by the highway near the water. She hesitated. "I don't do far drives," she said. "I'll make it worth your while," he replied. The voice was steady, unhurried. By the time she reached the lobby, the air conditioning was blasting, and the man was already there, leaning casually near the elevators. He looked normal, the kind of man you might pass in a grocery store without a second thought. "Ready?" he asked. Megan followed. Shannon Gilbert's phone calls still haunt anyone who's heard them. On that night, she was running, barefoot, disoriented. The wind was howling into the phone as she pleaded for help. "They're trying to kill me," she told the 911 operator. She banged on the doors of darkened houses, desperate for someone to open. Somewhere behind her in the shadows, a figure was moving. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but the darkness along the marsh made it impossible to see clearly. Her breathing was ragged. The cold air burned her lungs. She disappeared before dawn. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been there. The isolation of Gilgo Beach at night. The road runs tight between the marsh and the dunes. On one side, the skeletal remains of dead reeds rattle in the wind. On the other, the Atlantic crashes against the sand in an endless rhythm. There are no streetlights, just the occasional gleam from a house window far apart, like watchful eyes in the distance. And for years, someone used that darkness. Someone who knew the roads. Someone who knew the tides. Someone who could make people vanish. December 2010 began cold and gray. Police were out searching, not for bodies, but for a missing woman. They had dogs, boots in the sand, flashlights cutting through the wind. It was a German shepherd named Blue who found the first one. The officer following him froze when the beam of his flashlight caught something pale against the dune grass. At first, he thought it was driftwood wrapped in a tarp. Then he saw the burlap, and beneath it bones. That was just the beginning. Over the next days, they found more, each wrapped in burlap. each dumped within a short stretch of road. For women, for lives, for nights that ended at Gilgo Beach, and someone out there watching it all unfold. The burlap was coarse against Detective Brewer's gloves. It crackled faintly in the wind as he crouched over it, feeling the shape beneath. The wrong kind of shape. He didn't need to open it to know. The air around the dunes felt heavier now. Even the other officers scattered across the beach seemed to move slower, their voices dropping into tense murmurs. Above them, the sky was an unbroken wall of gray, pressing down on the scene. "Bag it," Brewer said, standing up. The crime scene techs moved in. But before the body was even loaded into the coroner's van, Blue, the German Shepherd, began tugging at his lead again, nose down, pulling toward the next dune. It didn't take long to find the second one. By the third day, they had four women, each wrapped in burlap, each placed with the same eerie precision, far enough from the road to avoid casual notice, close enough for someone who knew the terrain to move quickly. The media swarmed. Helicopters hovered overhead, sending sharp, snapping shadows across the dunes. Reporters stood bundled in coats, their hair whipped by the wind as they shouted into cameras. Locals locked their doors. And somewhere, someone was watching. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello. Their names were printed in bold on every newspaper. But to the killer, they were something else entirely. Chosen. Investigators pored over phone records. Each had been an escort advertising online. Each had been contacted by a man who knew how to stay invisible. Calls routed through burner phones. Appointments set at odd hours. No video. No trace. The only sliver of a lead came from Melissa's family. Weeks after she vanished, her younger sister began receiving calls from Melissa's phone. The voice was calm, amused almost. He asked her obscene questions, described what he had done to Melissa in cold, measured detail. And then he laughed. The calls came from crowded places in Manhattan, busy enough that tracing them was nearly impossible. By February, the leads were already drying up. Detective Brewer sat in the command post, a rented trailer parked near the beach, staring at the map tacked to the wall. Colored pins marked the locations of each body. From above, they formed a narrow cluster, too tight to be coincidence. If he's dumping them this close together, he's confident, Brewer muttered to his partner. Confident meant comfortable. Comfortable meant local. But every interview, every tip, seemed to fizzle out. Then, in March, another discovery. Not 4 bodies. 6. 2 more women. And disturbingly, a child. Her name was never released. She was only identified as the daughter of one of the victims. Her remains were found wrapped in a blanket, not burlap. Smaller, careful. The find shifted the tone of the case. This wasn't just about sex workers being targeted. This was someone who had crossed another line entirely. But still no suspect. As months passed, the theories multiplied. Some believed there were 2 killers, maybe even 3, using the same dumping ground. The differences in victim types, some buried for years, others more recent, seemed too wide for one man. Others argue the opposite, that this was the work of one meticulous predator adapting his methods. One retired detective, sipping black coffee in a diner off the highway, told a reporter he's a ghost. You can't catch a ghost unless he wants you to. It was the phone calls that haunted Brewer most. Melissa's sister remembered every word, every pause. She said the voice was deep, but not so deep it felt unnatural. He pronounced certain words sharply, like he was careful about being understood. And when he laughed, it wasn't sudden. It built slowly, like he was savoring it. The tech team ran voice pattern analysis. Too much background noise. Too much movement. Still, Brewer kept thinking about it. What kind of man calls the family of his victim? What kind of man risks that? Someone who wants to keep the fear alive. In April 2011, searchers pushed deeper into the brush, expanding the perimeter. That's when they found the dismembered remains. Not in burlap, this time. Some in plastic, some buried shallow. Different victims. Different disposal method. It sparked the multiple killers theory again. But the forensics teams noted one chilling similarity. Most of these victims had been strangled. It was late summer when the first real lead came in months. A local woman claimed she'd been approached by a man in a dark truck near Gilgo Beach. She remembered his eyes, pale, almost colorless, and the way he smiled without moving the rest of his face. When she turned him down, he'd driven away slowly, as if memorizing her. She reported it, but by the time police followed up, the description had blurred in her memory. By late 2011, the case had gone national. News vans lined Ocean Parkway. Amateur sleuths arrived with cameras, posting theories online. The Suffolk County Police Department faced mounting criticism. Why hadn't they caught him? Why had it taken Shannon Gilbert's disappearance to start looking at all? Inside the department, tensions boiled. The chief clashed with detectives over resource allocation. Brewer knew the truth. The longer it went unsolved, the bolder the killer would become. It was November when the call came in. A jogger had found something along the dunes. Another burlap sack. Another woman. The killer was still out there. Still moving in the same territory. Still unafraid. Brewer stood on the shoulder of Ocean Parkway that night, looking out toward the black expanse of the Atlantic. The wind roared in his ears. Somewhere out there, a man was sleeping soundly, knowing he had beaten them again. And in that moment, Brewer realized something he hadn't admitted before. The killer wasn't just hiding in the darkness. The darkness was his home. The map was still there, pins marking every discovery along the parkway. The photos of the women stared back at him from a corkboard. He'd memorized their faces long ago, but still he looked. Outside, snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes, blurring the streetlights. It had been over a year since the first body was found, and they were no closer. In the hall, the low hum of a vending machine was the only sound. The Suffolk County Police Department had changed leadership. The new chief, James Burke, made it clear. This investigation was his now. Burke didn't like the FBI's involvement. He didn't like outside eyes on his case. And almost overnight, the investigation shifted inward. More meetings, more closed-door decisions. Detectives were pulled from the task force. Some were reassigned. Brewer kept his post, but it was clear. Questions would have to be asked carefully now. And the killer, he had to know. From 2012 to 2015, the phone stopped ringing. No more bodies. No more calls to families. The press moved on to other stories. The dunes grew over with tall grass again, erasing the tracks of what had happened there. But the families didn't forget. Lorraine Ella, mother of Megan Waterman, kept calling the police. "You're forgetting them," she'd say. "Don't you dare forget them." Maureen's sister printed her photo on flyers, even years later, and handed them out to strangers in grocery store parking lots. They kept the names alive. In 2016, the FBI re-entered the case. Quietly, methodically, they began reanalyzing old evidence, burlap fibers, cell phone pings, surveillance footage too grainy to have been useful before. Technology had caught up. One of the first breakthroughs was subtle. A pattern in the burner phone usage. Every call to the victims came from phones that had briefly connected to cell towers near one specific cluster of neighborhoods. The circle on the map was getting smaller. Brewer had a list. One name was a doctor, lived nearby, had a history of soliciting escorts, but nothing solid tied him to the bodies. Another was a former cop known for violence, but alibis always seemed to cover him when the victims went missing. And then there was the architect. Quiet, successful, lived in Massapequa Park, right within the narrowed zone, owned property out east. The kind of man who blended in so well you'd never look twice. There was something about him. The way his work allowed him to study building sites, roads, landscapes. The kind of mind that notices the places where people don't look. The break came from something as small as a discarded pizza crust. In 2022, detectives retrieved it from a trash can outside the architect's office. The DNA on the crust matched hairs found on one of the burlap wrappings. It wasn't enough to arrest him outright, not yet, but it was enough to watch him. Surveillance teams followed him through the cold months, noting his routines, the way he lingered near certain coastal roads. It was early morning when the black SUVs rolled up to the quiet street in Massapequa Park. Neighbors peered from behind curtains as heavily armed officers approached the small, tan house. Inside, the architect was still in shorts and a t-shirt when they put him in cuffs. His name, Rex Hoyerman. The headlines exploded. Photos of his face, blank, heavy-lidded, filled every news site. Over the following weeks, investigators tore apart his home. The basement was sealed off for days. They brought in cadaver dogs, dug up the backyard, pulled computers, phones, hundreds of boxes of evidence. Neighbors whispered about what they'd seen. One claimed to have heard drilling late at night for years. Another swore he'd seen the man standing in his backyard during storms, just watching the street. Even with the arrest, nothing feels settled. The police say they have evidence linking Hoyerman to at least 3 of the original victims. But there are more bodies along that stretch of beach. Victims killed before and after those 3. Is he the Long Island serial killer? Or just one of them? Brewer sat in his car one night, parked along Ocean Parkway. The wind off the water rattled the steering wheel in his hands. Somewhere behind the dunes, the tide was rolling in. The headlights picked out the tall grass, swaying in the dark. He thought about the others, the ones they still hadn't solved. Some were out there, maybe in a house with the lights off. Another man was watching the same water, thinking the same thoughts. The streets of Massapequa Park didn't feel the same anymore. It had been months since Rex Hoyerman's arrest, but the neighborhood still carried a strange quiet, the kind that settles after a tornado passes, when you're left staring at what's broken and what's still standing. The house was empty now, its windows boarded, the lawn growing wild. The yellow police tape had been gone for weeks, but nobody walked past it after dark. Children crossed the street rather than past the cracked driveway. Some neighbors still swore they saw lights in the windows at night. For some, the arrest brought a bitter kind of relief. Lorraine, Ella, Megan Waterman's mother, told reporters she could finally start to breathe again. But in the same breath, she admitted, "I don't know if he's the only one." Maureen Brainerd Barnes' sister was more blunt. "If you think this end with him, you're wrong." They had lived for years knowing the killer was still out there. That kind of fear doesn't leave easily. The search of Hoyerman's home had unearthed strange items. Dozens of burner phones, maps of Long Island's coastline, some marked with faint pencil lines. A locked cabinet holding hundreds of ID cards belonging to strangers. And in the basement, a soundproof room. It had no windows. The walls were lined with heavy insulation. The police never said what, if anything, they found in that room. Brewer sat in the task force office, flipping through a file labeled simply Jane Doe. This woman had been found in 1996, long before Hoyerman's suspected murders. Her body dumped near the same stretch of highway. She didn't match his known victims, and the forensics didn't tie him to her. But her case was one of many that still had no resolution. The implication was clear. Someone else had been hunting before him, and maybe after. It was late September when Brewer found himself driving the old search route again. The dunes rose on one side, black against the sky. On the other, the marsh stretched out like a frozen sea of grass, whispering in the wind. Every few miles, he'd pull over, cut the engine, and listen. Some nights it was only the ocean. Other nights, he swore he heard movement in the reeds. Not animals, something heavier. The task force phone hadn't rung in weeks. Then one evening it did. The voice on the other end was male. "Calm, steady. You didn't get them all," he said. Brewer's hand tightened around the receiver. "Who is this?" The man chuckled, low, deliberate, the kind of laugh that crawled under your skin. Then the line went dead. The next morning, Brewer was on the sand before sunrise. The air was cold, the sky bruised with the first light. Near the edge of the grass, he saw it, something sticking out of the sand. At first, it looked like driftwood, but as he stepped closer, he saw the coarse threads of burlap. It was new. The fibers hadn't weathered.